Hello there, it's Nick Nutch back again one more time. I want to do a video about freedom of speech, and I want to see whether there's any actual arguments against it. Now, I don't want you to think that anything I'm putting in this video today is in fact my views. I'm certainly not trying to suggest that these are views that you should have or you should incorporate into your life. I'm not trying to be your moral instructor in this one particular video. It's literally a question of just like bouncing a few ideas around and see whether we can try and get another perspective out there in the world, so to speak. Now, just think about freedom of speech and freedom of thought. I mean, the word freedom essentially means without imprisonment and without constraints. What would that actually mean if that was taken to, I suppose, what you could regard as being its logical conclusion? But of course it doesn't really have a logical conclusion, does it? Because either you have freedom of speech or you have some constraints on your speech, or you have freedom of thought, or you have some constraints on your freedom of thought. Okay, so essentially what is complete freedom of thought? Well, that would mean no constraints by structures of reasoning, logic, scientific methodology, the creative thought processes in any way whatsoever, no structure whatsoever, no thoughts that would obey any particular cultural strain of identity, thought, morality, motives, or emotion. So possibly even going against or going contrary to the mainstream of thought. That would legitimize thoughts about suicide, murder, rape, burglary, property crime, arson. That would be freedom of thought. And freedom of action would come from it, presumably. So therefore, total freedom of action will be the individual acting as an individual in a manner which would counteract or contradict everything and any singular form of constraint to action. So, outlandish or inappropriate fashions, men turning up to work wearing absolutely nothing, for instance. That would be a freedom of speech, or a freedom, that would be a freedom of action. Act. A means of self-expression taken to the logical conclusion of being without constraints. And also another form of freedom of speech would be to encourage people to murder the boss. Yeah, to encourage people to do crime. Because there will be no moral constraints, no social constraints, no ideological constraints, and anything goes. So you could be driven purely by lust and desire for satisfaction, rather than necessarily something that would benefit yourself and other people. Now, in practice and in reality, what kind of people, realistically, what kind of people do these things, or say these things, or think these things? Well, in our society, they're the kind of people who are locked up in mental homes or in prisons, away from the rest of civilization. So, is there really, and I mean really, any freedom of thought, speech, and action in the world today? No, there isn't. Because essentially, society and social norms and cultural groups, think and behave in certain ways. And it's the group mentality which actually maintains the survival of the group. I mean, to do lots of lovely YouTube videos about the importance of freedom of speech, or the importance of freedom of action. You haven't got any freedom of speech. You never have had. You never will do. Because you're still constrained in the methods of communication. A form of freedom of speech would be to me to do a 1 whole hour video of me going whoop, 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 wouldn't be understandable to anybody. But instead I've got constraints. I've got the constraints of the English language. I've got the constraints of what the social group, namely my audience, will be able to understand. I've got the constraints of my pronunciation and my accent, which have been laid upon me through years of life experience. So even when I'm speaking in a free and liberal manner, I still have constraints on my speech. So total freedom of speech could be the incitement to riot, the incitement to murder, or something which is unintelligent and unintelligible, and would not actually be within a language that could be understood by anybody else. So there is no freedom of speech. Never has been, never will be. Quite a shocking thought, really, isn't it? But it's something we have to accept. So when we are talking about the preservation of freedom of speech, what are we really saying? What we're really saying is that we are representing some views of an individual or an interest group that wants to be able to express without being suppressed. That's what we're really saying, right? So it's not a question of freedom of speech, is it? It's a question of freedom from suppression of ideas which are contrary to the ideas of another cultural group. It's not freedom of speech. It's not freedom of thought. It is freedom for a political group to be able to express itself for their own political purposes. It's not freedom of speech, not freedom of action, not freedom of thought. Because people within every single political group, they're still constrained by some kind of principles of thought, reasoning, belief, ideology, speech and language, social and cultural norms. There's no freedom there. Just something to think about. The comment section is open. Please feel free to use it. God bless.